Okay, I'm not sure I'm certainly not going to be able to say as much as should be said about Kant's aesthetics. This is about Kant's third critique, and I think it's fair to say that this work doesn't really have the same importance for us as its predecessors. So the Critique of Pure Reason addresses what are still central concerns of epistemology, metaphysics, and philosophy of mind. The second critique, paired with the groundwork, articulates a position that every contemporary moral philosopher, I think, regards as worth engaging with, and some probably regard as deeply right about fundamental matters, at least. The Critique of Judgement is really not in the same league, and the difficulties begin when we try to say what it is a critique of. If the title is to be believed, then Kant's subject is Urteilskraft, but judgment as such is only discussed in the introduction, and it is in any case for us a kind of topic in philosophical logic, which is certainly not Kant's concern here. While the notion of a power or faculty of judgment hardly resonates with our concerns. Only one of the topics treated in the book, the aesthetic, has a firm place on our contemporary agenda, and the bulk of the attention paid to the third critique is accordingly directed at the first of its two parts, called the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, which is fairly standardly taken in isolation from its surroundings. The second part of the work, the Critique of Teleological Judgment, centres on a problem that has, to all appearances, been overtaken by Darwin, while the other bits and pieces contained in the book, these are a few sections, brief sections on the methodology and presuppositions of the natural sciences, some passages on the philosophy of history or culture. There's a lengthy restatement of Kant's moral theology, and a rather strange new account of what defines human cognition. All of these don't obviously belong to a single train of thought. So all in all, then, the work can give something of the impression of a kind of dog's dinner. And it can certainly seem that once one has liberated Kant's aesthetics from their textual cage and picked over the remainder, that the interest of the third critique is confined to Kant's scholarship. Well, if we want to know what, in Kant's eyes, holds all of these disparate topics together and makes the third critique more than a collection of footnotes and appendices to his critical system, then we need to look at the long introduction to the work, where we find Kant explaining its unitary project in different ways. The introduction is an exercise in what Kant calls architectonic, and this he defines as the art of system, where system means an intellectual structure that employs ideas of reason, ideas with a capital I, to transform an aggregate of common cognitions into Wissenschaft, scientific knowledge, a genuine unity. And the key to the architectonic of the third critique, as Kant explains it in the introduction, is not the concept of judgment as such, but the more complex idea that the faculty of judgment, which stands between our two other conceptual faculties, reason and understanding, the faculty of judgment has a connection, a kind of subterranean connection with the faculty of pleasure and unpleasure. And that faculty intermediates between the theoretical and the practical. So at the end of the introduction, we get, this is the map of the faculties that Kant gives us. And the idea is that the triadic division of the mind as a whole, so the left-hand column, is mapped onto or reproduced within its first term, the faculty of cognition, and that yields the second column. And perhaps I should say the art that figures in the last column refers not just to fine art, but primarily actually to nature as art, that is, nature regarded as a technique, or nature considered teleologically. So that is the architectonic picture that Kant wants to substantiate. Now, a crucial part of his story in the third critique is that judgment, and this is a new distinction he's making, divides into two classes, what he calls determinant judgment and what he calls reflective or reflecting judgment. And these are distinguished by the different ways in which they connect particulars and universals. So determinant judgment subsumes a particular encountered in cognition, something you meet, under a concept which is already given to you, that's already there in your cognitive stock. Reflective judgment, by contrast, and this is the new concept, seeks for particulars, given particulars, a concept which is not already given. So it's in the business of forming, constructing, discovering new concepts. Now, the first class, determinant judgments, which have both theoretical and practical varieties, have already been dealt with in the earlier critiques. So explicating reflective judgment is the new task. And Kant tells us in the introduction that associated constitutively with it is the concept of an end or purpose, Zweck. And some reflective judgments apply this concept explicitly, and those that do not nonetheless presuppose it in their background. So Kant's claim is that using this apparatus, we can substantiate this model of our rational powers, and the main body of the third critique is an attempt to supply all of the detail and fill it out. Well, it's safe to say, I think, that the architectonic project, as I've just described it, it's unlikely to grab us. And while we may certainly look with favour and interest on Kant's endeavour to extend his account of how experience is conceptualized, so the new theory of reflective judgment, we may think, look, that looks very interesting. We can reasonably doubt that this new idea really needs Kant's full architectonic surroundings. But Kant has another way of explaining the task of the third critique, which makes it seem considerably more inviting. And here he focuses on the needs of the moral agent, who he now admits has been somewhat left adrift by the two earlier critiques, insofar as each of these has merely sought to account for its own domain without coordinating them. So the first critique showed that practical reasons, legislation over the domain of freedom, and theoretical reasons, legislation over nature, that these can't conflict, even though their objects, their territory, objects of possible experience is the same. And then the second critique showed that once we've in this way made the concept of freedom legitimate and unproblematic, showed what use you can make of it in the context of the metaphysics of morals. But this separation of freedom of nature has not been followed up by any reunification. And this is the famous paragraph from the introduction stating the problem, as Kant now concedes it to be. So he writes, now, although there is an incalculable gulf fixed between the domain of the concept of nature as the sensible and the domain of the concept of freedom as the supersensible, so that from the former to the latter, thus by means of the theoretical use of reason, no transition is possible, just as if there were so many different worlds, the first of which can have no influence on the second, yet the latter should have an influence on the former. Thus, there must still be a ground of the unity of the supersensible that grounds nature with that which the concept of freedom contains practically. The concept of which, even if it does not suffice for cognition of it, either theoretically or practically, and thus has no proper domain of its own, nevertheless makes possible the transition from the manner of thinking in accordance with the principles of the one to that in accordance with the principles of the other. Okay, so this talk of unifying freedom and nature as a task that has not yet been but needs to be attempted, in a way this brings to mind a very familiar philosophical task for us, the problem of understanding the relation of the mental to the physical, or the relation of normativity to nature. And this is obviously of high importance for us. What you think about those distinctions, dualities, is decisive for what you think about naturalism, or the particular form of naturalism that you endorse. Okay, so that might seem to make the Critique of Judgment a book for our times, but there are, and I want to indicate, deep differences between Kant's conception of the task of unification and the tasks that occupy us. And these, I think, once again, seem to set the third critique at a historical distance. The first point to emphasize is that Kant denies that a unification of the physical and the mental is possible. According to the first critique, transcendental idealism tells us how physical and mental representations are systematically interrelated, but it denies that there is any further knowable essence of the mental or the material. So on Kant's view, it's only if you make the mistake, it's only if you mistake inner and outer appearances for things in themselves that you'll think it makes sense to try and determine their underlying metaphysical relation. So Kant just signs off on the mind-body problem as we have it. Second, and actually even more importantly, Kant's task of unification has the very specific presupposition that what he calls freedom has at its core the moral law, or pure practical reason. So in Kant's view, if practical reason were exclusively empirical, then its integration with theoretical reason would present no problem. Practical reason would actually already be integrated with nature, since its job would just be to steer action in accordance with the inclinations nature has given us. Practical reason would just be a way of computing the most efficient means to the given ends. Well, there's room for different interpretations of the exact problem to which Kant is drawing our attention in this passage, but from what he says later in the main body of the text, it would appear that he's concerned with the success conditions of the worldly moral enterprise. So the thought is that in order to act morally, or in order for it to make sense for me to undertake to act morally, I need to believe that my actions qua moral stand a chance of success. And the problem is that I have no reassurance on that front by my long experience of getting my body to move when I want it to, or succeeding in morally indifferent tasks. So my success in getting bottles out of the Coke machine, this tells me only that I, as a natural creature, fit well enough into the world. The question is whether I also do so as a moral being. And it's worth noting that this present problem of moral reassurance differs from the one that Kant addressed in the dialectic of the second critique, and which he there claimed to solve by means of the theological postulates. In the second critique, the problem concerned the non-identity of morality and happiness, the fact that each goes, so it seems, its own way. And that threatened to simply freeze moral willing at its root. The worry was, if to form a dutiful will is just to say goodbye to any prospect of happiness, then the demands of morality are nonsensical for creatures like us with a mixture of rational and sensible natures. Here, by contrast, in the third critique, the problem is that even if I am reassured by Kant's moral theology that morality and happiness will, at the end of the day, outside the world, if not in it, harmonize, still, I have no reason to think that the world is going to prove receptive to my moral purposes, that it's the sort of world in which it makes sense to act morally. So the problem will express itself in concrete worries about the seeming futility of trying to establish a just society in the face of global capitalism or whatever, but ultimately it consists in just this hiatus at the intersection of theoretical and practical reason. The problem is that no content has yet been given to the thought that the moral world and the natural world are one and the same. Still less do we have reasons for thinking of them as congruent. Now, of course, we can frame thoughts in which elements from each world are adjoined, so I can think of any given natural object. I can think, this is the object that I've borrowed and promised to give back, and I can act on those thoughts, but at a deeper level, I have no insight as yet into how this is possible. So, to summarize, because Kant's specific problem of unifying freedom and nature presupposes this identification of freedom with morality, conceived as pure practical reason, and because Kant's resolution of that problem is not going to help with the mind-body problem that we've resumed from the early moderns, it seems there is little reason to expect the third critique to engage with our concerns. And I think that if we turn to the detail of its argument, then we find this suspicion largely confirmed. So I'm going to give here a very quick statement of the argument of the critique of judgment as a whole. The argument begins with Kant's analysis of judgments of taste, which is guided by the assumption that these must be differentiated sharply from moral judgments on the one side and judgments of the mere agreeable on the other. And as Kant's analysis unfolds, we learn that aesthetic response arises from a special configuration of our ordinary cognitive faculties. And it's demonstrated that beautiful objects manifest a transcendental fact, the fact that nature is mind-friendly, mind-congenial. Moreover, that nature is mind-congenial in a way that goes beyond the conformity of nature to our understanding argued in the first critique. So Kant's thought is that we look at the rose, we find it beautiful. We don't prescribe to the rose its specific form, on account of which its apprehension brings pleasure. The rose didn't, as it were, need to give us pleasure in order to be knowable, but it does so nevertheless. So the thought is that this deepens the sense in which mind and nature cohere. It shows that there's another deeper level at which our theoretical power and nature are fitted to one another. Well, that is all well and good, but it's not enough clearly to affect a rapprochement of freedom and nature. For that, Kant would need to show that despite the sharp distinction of aesthetic from moral judgments that he makes at the beginning, there is nonetheless a point at which the two, the aesthetic and the moral, come together. And so Kant extends his analysis in an attempt to show that the rightness which judgments of beauty lay claim to, so this would be as it were, the rose's kind of normative halo, its calling for pleasure to be taken in it, and our calling in our judgment of taste for others to take pleasure in the rose. All of that, on Kant's account, can be accounted for only if we have in view, though of course in a very indefinite and indirect way, the moral good. The moral good must provide the foundation, in that sense, of judgments of taste. So Kant puts it by saying that the beautiful is a symbol of morality, and that taste is regarded from one angle. It's a power of estimating the way in which moral ideas have been rendered sensible. Okay. The other half, or the other element in Kant's aesthetic theory, the theory of the sublime, which is kind of junior partner of his theory of beauty, reaches the same result through a more circuitous route. With beauty, the moral good is, as it were, shining through the natural object. The rose is at one with its morally purposive, supersensible ground. In the case of the sublime, so this would be the towering mountain or the raging storm, the face that nature displays to us is, on the contrary, indifferent or hostile. But, according to Kant, because this extinction of our empirical significance, it shows us how little we matter in the empirical scheme of things, because that then brings to awareness our essential transcendence of nature, the thought that what I am in my true self, a being with a moral vocation, that is something that nature cannot threaten or destroy. The sublime, therefore, teaches us that this counter-purposivity found at the surface of nature, its disagreement with our interests, apparent disagreement with our interests, is in fact in the service of an underlying moral purposiveness. So that is very briefly the argument of the critique of aesthetic judgment and the role of morality in it. The second half of the work, the critique of teleological judgment, just makes fresh start, begins afresh with another class of distinctive forms encountered in nature, not this time beautiful objects, but just natural organisms, plants and animals, and argues that these demand for their explanation, in fact, even just to be conceptualized, the concept of a whole which determines its parts. And the formation of this concept, according to Kant, manifests the reflective power of judgment. The plant or animal presented a form that just made no sense in mechanical terms. We couldn't explain why it had to be like that, thinking mechanistically. So we went looking for a concept under which to bring it. And Kant says that to conceive an object thus, in light of the concept of, as purposive or as a purposive whole, is to think of the concept of the whole as producing its parts, in the same way as a watchmaker has the concept of and the blueprint for a watch and makes the parts accordingly. And since the production by concepts of objects satisfying them, that by our lights that just is purposive rational agency, Kant tells us that natural organisms must be conceived as natural ends. Okay, So that's the necessity of teleological thinking on Kant's account. And it immediately sets a problem, in fact, a double problem, because teleological judgment, though it is judgment of the very same objects that we think via the categories and in accordance with the mechanical principle, teleological judgment is not licensed by the first critique, and moreover, it appears to stand in competition with mechanical explanation. So Kant's solution is to admit teleology on the basis of what he calls a strictly regulative construal of its status. This is the Kantian claim. Teleological judgments are not constitutive, they are regulative. And this allows him to say that teleological judgment is just the result of conjoining our need to understand organic form, which has this non-mechanical appearance, the agreement of that with the form of our reason. Our reason is always in the business of trying to find wholes, totalities. And this object seems to be a totality in a sense that the mechanistic vision cannot accommodate. And secondly, to say that the judgment is regulative is to say that it just has as-if force. So when we say that there are purposes in nature, or that animals and plants are natural ends, we're saying they can be considered as if they were produced in accordance with the concept. And that as if means that we're claiming nothing at all regarding the intrinsic constitution of the object. So the threat of conflict with mechanism is seen off. So once again, Kant has enlarged the scope of theoretical reason, but he needs more if this new teleologically enriched theoretical picture of nature is to be joined up with freedom. And this last crucial step is taken by, in effect, just allowing our reason to take its natural course. So the train of thought is as follows. If some natural objects are conceived as realizing the concept of purpose, then, as in every field of rational knowledge, we must form the concept of a system of purposes. And systematicity demands a highest unifying point. So if we're to think of purpose in nature systematically, then we need something within nature which can be thought of as the final purpose of nature. And that, whatever it might be, would have to also, of course, stand outside nature in some sense, because one would have to be able to think of nature as existing for the sake of that end. So we want something that has a foot in nature and a foot outside it, and of course, the only candidate here is humanity, not as a bare natural species, but as a sensible being that bears its own purpose within itself, the unconditionally valuable goodwill, which cannot be a means to any further end. So the final purpose of nature is man's goodwill. So we arrive at the same point as the critique of aesthetic judgment, a vision of nature as providing us with a moral home. Okay, so what I've just said, this is a very curtailed and selective sketch of the territory covered in the third critique, but the point I wanted to bring out is just the way in which the culminating point of both of its halves, and also the point where the two halves join up, is provided by morality, conceived in Kant's distinctive way. And for the record, I'm not saying, of course, that there is nothing in Kant's aesthetic theory or his theory of teleology that can stand on its own 2 feet, independently of morality. What I'm saying is just that to the extent that we have in mind the task of freedom-nature unification, that task, the moral element is absolutely essential, and without it, the third critique just falls apart, which may be all to the good, but which means giving up on the work as a unified project. Okay, so now, this is as well the second half of my talk. I want to change angle and talk about the reception of the work. And my motive here is not to turn away from philosophical to merely historical matters, but to try and use the history of philosophy as a way of approaching the third critique on something closer to its own terms. And the first very salient historical fact to register is that the third critique exerted its greatest influence by a long chalk in the immediate Kantian aftermath on the German Idealists, who regarded it as the most important of the 3 critiques, a view that would is surprising in our light. Now, they did not, of course, think that the third critique was independent from the others, but they thought that it set the agenda for what philosophy after Kant should do, or put another way, which for them more or less came to the same thing, what should be done with Kant's philosophy. So here are some quotations from Schelling and Hegel, who both of whom pay tribute to third critique in writings from early to late. So the first from Schelling's Of the I as Principle of Philosophy, written when he was his second major philosophical publication, written when he was 19, published when he was just 20. He ranks the critique of teleological judgment alongside the transcendental deduction of the first critique. Again, a very, very surprising estimation from our point of view. So he writes, whoever has read his deduction of the categories and his critique of the teleological power of judgment in the spirit in which everything he ever wrote must be read, sees the depth of his meaning and insight, which seems almost unfathomable. Kant presented the final substrate of being an identity in a manner which appears possible only in a genius who, rushing ahead of himself, as it were, can descend the steps from the highest point, whereas others can ascend only step by step. And Schelling's suggestion, the implication is, of course, that Schelling, in this early work, he's doing the step-by-step ascending. He's, as it were, spelling out everything that Kant kind of grasped, but didn't bother to lay down. So Schelling's claim is that Schelling's own sort of Spinozistic idealism is actually present in Kant himself. Secondly, and this is from about 40 years later, the Munich lectures on the history of philosophy. He describes it as Kant's deepest work, which, if he could have begun with it as he finished with it, would have probably given his whole philosophy another direction. Again, this suggestion that the right way to read Kant's philosophy is kind of backwards from the third critique to the first. Hegel, this early essay, sorry, I haven't put the quotation there. Hegel's early Faith and Knowledge says that the critique of teleological judgment is the most interesting point in the Kantian system. And then in this essay on ancient skepticism from the same year, 1802, so again very early, he says that the mere philosophy of understanding that we find in Kant has at last been elevated above itself, and the effective presence of the idea is already visible in the outward scaffolding of Kant's philosophy, but it also emerges more explicitly at the culminating points of its syntheses, especially in the Critique of the Power of Judgement. And then from the Encyclopaedia Logic, again singles out the third critique as coming closer than anywhere else in Kant to the Hegelian idea, and in fact is the only place where Kantian philosophy rises to the speculative height. Okay. Then a final point to mention for those who are interested in, again, Hegel's late lectures on the history of philosophy. Hegel says that the third critique has a special importance, and that this is due to the fact that it was in that work and only in that work that Kant recognized that there were philosophical demands that his mere philosophy of the understanding had failed to meet. Now, so one remark about all of this, in connection with what I was saying about the way in which the moral dependence of the third critique makes it somewhat alien to our concerns. The German idealists, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, did not accept Kant's accounts of moral knowledge, moral psychology, or human freedom. They did not think that morality was pure practical reason in Kant's sense. So they didn't accept his thesis that freedom has at its core Kantian pure practical reason. However, and this is how their response to the third critique just goes in an opposite direction from ours, they were in absolutely no doubt that the concept of freedom represents the right master concept for purposes of thinking what it is that's distinctive about human beings that sets them apart from nature, and for supposing that the comprehensive task of philosophy should be defined in terms of this opposition of freedom to nature. So the German idealists accept Kant's formula. The task is to unify freedom and nature without thinking that freedom must be what Kant says it is. Okay. So now, in a way, on to the main business. There are two questions about the German idealist reception of the third critique that I want to discuss. So I said they took the third critique to set an agenda, and these quotations make very clear they don't think that Kant has said the last word in the third critique. So the first question is, so what in their eyes is wrong with or missing from the third critique such that it points up the need for further philosophical work? And the second question follows on. If further philosophical work is needed, then can it be done on the basis of anything contained within the third critique itself, or does it require other resources? So we can begin to answer the first question by looking at the two major works in the post-Kantian period that constitute extended responses to the third critique. And these are Schiller's Letters on Aesthetic Education, although he doesn't describe it as such, but I think it would be agreed that's the right way to view it. And then Herder's Caligony, which is an extremely long polemical attack on Kant's critique of aesthetic judgment. So Schiller is roughly pro-Kantian with reservations. Herder is virulently anti-Kantian. But the two of them, they agree on one thing. They agree that human personality stands in need of a wholeness which is not on the cards if freedom and nature can only be unified in the way and to the degree that the critique of judgment tells us. So Schiller, as is well known, argues that the aesthetic has the power to fuse freedom and nature within us. His strategy is to try and use this intermediate position that Kant accords to the aesthetic to, as it were, get behind the back of reason and our inclinations in order to remold them or recondition them. Herder's argument is that Kant's aesthetics just reveal the gross inadequacies of Kantian philosophy. It's what is, as it were, to be expected if you start from the idea that sense and intellect are divided. So for Herder, Kantianism is a lost cause. You can't repair it or improve it in the way that Schiller proposes, and we have to take a quite different approach. We have to retrieve a rich unitary concept of nature which will avoid Kant's dualistic dead end. Okay, so that's very briefly, that is the force of the two major responses to the third critique. Well, Herder's Caligony was not well received and certainly plays no direct role in the development of German idealism. But the kind of axiological sensibility to which it gives expression, this dissatisfaction with a deep division within in the nature of man between these two sides, that sensibility is absolutely characteristic of the age, and Schiller is responding to it too, and Schiller may be said to, in some way, have written a kind of ground plan for German idealism, as it were, pointed up lines of development that would extend post-Kantianism into Schelling and Hegel. Now, for the second, the further part of my answer to this question, the next thing to attend to is just the way in which this demand for wholeness, theoretical and axiological wholeness in the human being, is paralleled by the complaint that Kant fails in the critique of judgment to satisfy his own formal conditions for philosophical systematicity. So the thought is, here in the third critique, Kant is finally giving us the system, and then lo and behold, it fails. It fails to be a system. And this is the best statement that I've found of the point, and this comes from Fichte's rather later lectures. So he says, the way Kant's decisive and only truly meaningful works, the three critiques, come before us, Kant has made three starts. And then he discusses the first and second critiques, and they don't deliver. And so the critique of the power of judgment appears, and in its introduction, the most important part of this very important book, we find the confession, the passage we've seen, that the sensible and supersensible worlds must come together in a common but wholly unknown root, which would be the third absolute equals y. I say a third absolute, separate from the other two and self-sufficient, despite the fact that it is supposed to be the connection of both other terms. And I do not thereby treat Kant unjustly. Because if this y is inscrutable, then while it may indeed always contain the connection, I, at least, can neither comprehend it as such nor collaterally conceive the two terms as originating from it. If I am to grasp it, I must grasp it immediately as absolute, and I remain trapped forever, now as before, in the, for me and my understanding, three absolutes. Therefore, with this final decisive addition to his system, Kant did not in any way improve that which we owe to him. He only generously admitted and disclosed it himself. So the third critique is Kant's confession of failure and the warrant for taking Kantian idealism in the directions in which Fichte has taken it. So Fichte then adds another statement. He says, Kant first discovered the distinction between the sensible and supersensible worlds, and then added to his absolute the additional inexplicable quality of linking the two worlds. Well, I think this passage is highly revealing of what is at issue in the argument between Kant and his successors, and it repays close attention. So a few things about it. Fichte assumes three things, at least. First, that each of Kant's critiques must be taken as presenting an absolute, that whatever is posited as absolute must be grasped or grasped immediately as absolute. And thirdly, that Kant's invocation of a third term, this why to connect freedom and nature, fails because why, as theorized by Kant, is not equipped to be the root or the origin of freedom and nature. So, of those three assumptions, the first two clearly will be unhesitatingly rejected by Kant without discomfort. He will just reply that critical philosophy is not in the business of grasping absolutes. But the third point isn't, the third assumption is not so easily dismissed, because even if Fichte is wrong to suggest that why, the mediating term, needs to be grasped immediately as an absolute, he's surely right that Kant needs this why to have some independent identity if its connecting role is to be explanatory. Now, Kant may assert, he can say that this work is actually done in the Critique of Judgment because it gives us an account of what judgment amounts to as a power of its own with principles of its own. It tells us how the world may be conceived as a system of purposes whereby freedom and nature are interconnected. Well, be that as it may, I think Fichte again can reasonably retort that it's still not clear how interposing a third term between X and Z, freedom and nature, improves our situation. If our knowledge of Y is on a level with our knowledge of X and Z, freedom and nature, so if our knowledge of Y is similarly non-absolute, unself-grounding, then in a sense all we've done is added complexity to the picture. And we now need to understand not just how freedom and nature are connected, but how all these three elements hold together. So Fichte's point is that postulating why would bring a gain would make a philosophical gain only if it stood behind freedom and nature, grounding them at a deeper level. And that is certainly not what Kant is either prepared or able to claim regarding taste and purposivity. Well, lurking in the background here is this notorious single first principle issue that dominated discussion of Kant's epistemology in the first phase of its reception. So the issue here was, where is Kant's single first principle? There must be one. The debates are not quite the same, because here we're not really concerned with finding a principle that will resist skeptical doubt. But in both cases, Kant finds himself in difficulty because of a claim that he himself made in the first critique regarding what it is for knowledge to be systematic. So this statement from late on, if we survey the cognitions of our understanding in their entire range, then we find that what reason quite uniquely prescribes and seeks to bring concerning it is the systematic in cognition, i.e., its interconnection based on one principle. This unity of reason always presupposes an idea, namely of the form of a whole of cognition, which precedes determinate cognition of parts and contains the conditions for determining the place of each part in relation to the others. So this idea postulates complete unity of the understanding through which the cognition comes to be not merely a contingent aggregate, but a system interconnected in accordance with necessary laws. One cannot properly say that this idea is the concept of an object, but only that of the thoroughgoing unity of these concepts, insofar as the idea serves the understanding as a rule. So that is what we need for systematic knowledge. And if we hold Kant to his word, then the expectation of finding in the third critique a grounding or superordinate principle or faculty is not unreasonable. And to that extent, Fichte's disappointment with Kant seems justified. Now, what I want to do is make a suggestion about how Kant in the third critique is thinking about philosophical systematicity. And I'm afraid this won't really come out very clearly, but I hope it may seem that there is some truth in it. I think Kant in the third critique is operating with a different conception of systematicity from the one described in this passage. And this conception Kant does not anywhere articulate, at least not in the way that I'm about to do, so what I'm about to say falls on the side of reconstruction rather than exegesis. If we just begin with the experience of reading the book, I think every reader of the third critique will agree that the cumulative effect of the text is that of a kind of echo chamber in which structures on one side of a distinction are found to reappear, perhaps in inverted form, on the other. And Kant sets up this complex system of internal correspondences. And these correspondences are not deductive relations or relations of explanation. They are, if you like, purely formal. At the same time, the text gives this impression of conceptual movement, of pieces drawing together, converging on unity, but because the final point of unity is never achieved, the movement is never completed. So the pieces, as it were, remain in motion. And because what sets them in motion is not force of deduction, but what you might call elective affinity, the movement has a spontaneous character. It's as if the various domains, teleology, taste, and so on, were arranging themselves of their own accord, and yet at the same time in accordance with reason. Well, here is an example of what I mean. I mean, what I'm talking about is really the way in which, inside the critique of the third critique, you kind of begin to feel that you're in sort of a Gothic cathedral. It's got that much structure to it. So here is an example, perhaps not a very attractive Kantian paragraph, but anyway, it makes the point. In an object given in experience, purposiveness can be represented either on a merely subjective ground as a correspondence of its form in its apprehension prior to any concept with the faculties of cognition in order to unite the intuition with concepts for a cognition in general, or on an objective ground as a correspondence of its form with the possibility of the thing itself in accordance with the concept of it which precedes and contains the ground of this form. So the former is taste, the latter is teleology. We've seen that the representation of the first sort of purposiveness rests on the immediate pleasure in the form of the object in mere reflection on it. Thus, the representation of the second kind of purposiveness, since it relates the form of the object not to the cognitive faculties of the subject in the apprehension of it, but to a determinate cognition of the object under a given concept, has nothing to do with the feeling of pleasure in things, but rather with the understanding in judging them. Okay, not a lovely bit of prose, but what Kant is doing here, and in this very, very abstract way, he's trying to spell out the kinship and the differentiation of aesthetics and teleology. So he's saying both of these involve representing an object as purposive, one on subjective and the other on objective grounds. The subjective ground is a correspondence of the form of the object with my faculties of cognition, independently of any concept. The objective ground is a correspondence of the form of the object with the concept that provides the ground of the object. So the first involves form as apprehended, the latter form as conceptualized. So the first manifests itself sensibly in feeling, the latter intellectually in a judgment of the understanding. Though, immediately has to be said, the terms of that distinction too, of feeling versus judgment or understanding, are mutually implicating, because on Kant's account, the feeling which is distinctive of aesthetic experience rests on an activity of judgment. And then, on the other side, it's only because the mind has this kind of feel for purposive form, as taste shows, that nature can be taken up teleologically. So the upshot of all this is that aesthetics and teleology, this is as it were the two sides of the building, are each, as it were, the inversion of the other. Taste feels the purposivity which teleology thinks. Teleology concerns itself with what makes the object possible. Taste indexes the possibility of the objects figuring for us as an object. Okay, well, numerous other passages of this sort could be cited, and they make up really most of the introduction. And Kant has been derided for his obsession with architectonic. And in fact, he even has a footnote where he takes issue with somebody who's mocked him for looking for triadic divisions everywhere, and he explains that it's philosophically motivated. Well, the obsession, inverted commas, with architectonic is certainly more pronounced in the third critique than anywhere else. But Kant clearly regards it as a serious matter. And I think that this is because in the third critique, he's elevating architectonic from being merely the means by which one eventually arrives at a system. So that would be architectonic as art in the sense of techne, to architectonics being what systematicity consists in. So Kant, my suggestion is, in the third critique, is rejecting the conception of philosophical systematicity that Fichte assumes when he complains that Kant has failed to supply what is needed. Kant is not looking for interconnection based on one principle, as he put it in the first critique. Interconnection based on one principle is appropriate within the subsystems of philosophy, within the foundations of empirical knowledge, see, I think, and within metaphysics and morals. But the system of philosophy as a whole, with its freedom part and its nature part, that system just consists in an exposition of the interrelatedness of its subsystems. It just consists in architectonic work. Now, all of this, I accept, may sound a bit far-fetched, or it might seem to suggest that Kant in the third critique is offering a kind of quasi-aesthetic satisfaction, the architectural harmony of the system in place of philosophical understanding. But I think we can see how the architectonic conception serves, in Kant's view, strictly philosophical purposes, and even that Kant has an argument for why it's the only kind of philosophical systematicity that at least a human intellect can expect. So if we now go back to the incalculable gulf paragraph, we should just note or re-register the fact that Kant's statement of the aim of unification is highly restricted. The aim is to facilitate the transition from thinking in accordance with one set of principles to those of the other. And that is something different from cognizing their connection. So we want something that will allow us to intelligibly move from here to there, and that's different from knowing some further third object, some third absolute as Fichte conceives it. We should also note that in this paragraph, Kant talks in one breath of facilitating the transition and of positing an object that would rationalize it. And this suggests, to my mind, that the distinction that we would ordinarily draw between knowing something, cognizing an object, and then, on the other side, being able to do something, to move from here to there intellectually, Kant wants to treat that, in the context at hand at least, as a vanishing distinction. So his thought is that the two come to the same. What it is to grasp an object, what it is to be able to make a transition, these are the same things. And this, as kind of further evidence for this, the other paragraph that we had here, the paragraph from the first critique, where Kant said we need interconnection based on one principle, unity of reason, and then he talks about we need to have an idea. And then he says in the last sentence, one cannot properly say that this idea is the concept of an object, only that of the thoroughgoing unity of these concepts. So the distinction between the functional role of an idea in unifying or affecting architectonic unity and the representational role of the idea, that distinction is being pushed to the limit. And very clearly, that idea, that conception of how ideas should be regarded, appealed greatly to Peirce, and through him to the other pragmatists. Now, this notion that I've just attributed to Kant, that at the outer limit of transcendental reflection, our ideas of the supersensible are equivalent to rules for transition between domains. This idea is clearly strange and puzzling, and we should say something about how Kant might seek to account for it. And this takes us to the suggestion, other suggestion I want to make, that Kant has a way of rationalizing this modest conception of architectonic as all that a philosophical system can be. And this involves reference to two remarkable, well, actually one of two remarkable sections of the dialectic of teleological judgment. These are sections, the famous sections 76 to 77, where Kant comes up, as it were, out of the blue with this extraordinary description of the differences between what he calls our discursive mode of cognition, where you have to put a subject and a predicate or an intuition and a concept together, and a non-discursive mode of cognition, which, although we can't know that it exists, we can at least form the idea of it, that he calls an intuitive intellect. So this intuitive intellect will, in fact, it will be creative of its objects. I mean, that point won't be particularly important for us. Anyway, in section 77, he explains that this non-discursive cognition would proceed from the universal to the particular. So the statement, we can also conceive of an understanding which, since it is not discursive like ours but is intuitive, goes from the Kant's new rebarbative terminology, the synthetically universal, which is just intuition of a whole as such, to the particular, i.e. from the whole to the parts. So this would be an intellect that, just by entertaining an idea, could extract the particulars from it, the instances from it. So this is a way of thinking, in fact, a traditional way of thinking about divine understanding. So human cognition very clearly is not like this, because we have a priori concepts, but they don't contain any intuitions, and all of our determinate concepts of reality have to be built up laboriously out of intuitions of particular things. So God's knowledge goes top down, ours goes bottom up. And that's why we need to have reflective judgment, because the concepts are missing. We've got the particulars, we're looking for the concepts. And when this is appreciated, when we see that our cognition is bound to travel in exactly the opposite direction from that of an intuitive intellect, then it becomes clear, this isn't something that Kant says, but I'm interpolating, that the conception of systematicity as knowledge of a whole out of which the parts can be determined cannot be satisfied, or at least cannot be satisfied in a philosophical system. At the point where we would hope to realize it, our knowledge would cease to be discursive, and that would mean that we would cease to exist, we would be, as it were, extinguished as knowers. So we operate from down, we're at the bottom there, among the many, and we're trying to put the many together, and we've got this idea of a prior whole, and this idea is unrealizable by our cognition. But it has regulative value because it provides a kind of focal point towards which we can steer our cognition. And as long as we appreciate that its status is merely regulative, we avoid transcendental illusion. And what we can also think, and this is a point that Kant does spell out, is that our discursive representation, as it moves from parts to wholes, as it becomes more systematic with natural science growing, it is at the same time tracking the reality which is given to an intuitive intellect. So we're at the bottom looking up, trying to put the parts together into a whole. At the top is the divine creative intellect, and it is looking down, and it sees us, as it were, in the many, and our efforts to make our knowledge more systematic genuinely bring us closer to the top. So we are, as it were, seeing things in themselves, or thinking, knowing things in themselves from another side. We don't know them as things in themselves, but we are, in a sense, hooking onto them cognitively. Okay. Okay, let me just very briefly summarize the last few things I wanted to say. So the other question I raised was that of the extent to which the third critique provides resources for this more ambitious philosophical task which the German idealists took it to set. So the German idealists, they're the guys who want to stand up and occupy the standpoint of the one, roughly. Now, Fichte's view actually was that the third critique isn't particularly useful, and so Fichte goes back to themes of self-consciousness, moral consciousness, in his attempt to close the gap between freedom and nature. But the crucial decisive move to absolute idealism taken by Schelling does draw on the third critique. And I wanted to, I haven't really got time to expand on this, but I just wanted to point to this passage in the third critique where I think if Schelling were reading it, or he certainly read it, he didn't comment on it as such, I think we can see how in Schelling's eyes, Kant has at this point taken a step out of his merely subjective idealism into absolute idealism and then gone back. So let me just read through the passage. So Kant says, now it is clear that the reflecting power of judgment, given its nature, could not undertake to classify the whole of nature according to its empirical differences. So he's here talking, this is something I haven't really talked about, this is the role of reflective judgment in helping us to to know laws of nature. Yep. To classify the whole of nature according to its empirical differences, if it did not presuppose that nature itself specifies its transcendental laws in accordance with some sort of principle. So the thought is here that it would be, we couldn't even begin to reason inductively or look for natural kinds in nature or hazard guesses about the laws of nature unless we thought of nature as having a regularity that allows us to achieve that kind of knowledge of it. Now, the first critique didn't prove that nature must have that property, and Kant doesn't think that it can be proven. But it must be presupposed, according to Kant. So according to Kant, we must, for transcendental purposes, presuppose that nature specifies its transcendental laws in accordance with some sort of principle. And then Kant says, now, this principle can be none other than, another long Kantian sentence, that of the suitability for the capacity of the power of judgment itself for finding in the immeasurable multiplicity of things, blah, 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 blah. The special principle, the last sentence, the special principle of the power of judgment is thus: nature specifies its general laws into empirical ones in accordance with the form of a logical system in behalf of the, in brackets, our power of judgment. So in Schelling's eyes, what Kant has done, he's admitted that we have to think of nature as self-specifying, as autonomous, a Spinozistic, quasi-Spinozistic conception of nature. It differentiates itself. And then having made that admission, Kant tries to revoke it by saying that all that we're doing here is adopting a purely regulative principle. And the regulative principle just requires us to think of nature as doing things for us. So in the first part of Kant's thought, nature is granted its autonomy. And then in the second part, Kant characteristically subordinates nature to our cognitive needs. He says we must think of nature as if it were wanting us to be able to know it. And Schelling's point, very, very briefly, is that this really won't do. You can't have it both ways. If it is a transcendental requirement that we attribute this self-specification to nature, then we've got to hold with that. We can't go back into our Kantian subjectivity. And so the last quotation, Schelling, the view of nature that Schelling says we should extract from, so this is the real lesson to be learnt from the third critique, is in fact this view of nature as self-sufficient, self-relating, self-producing. And of course, Schelling has to tell a story now about how we fit into this, but that's not, in a way, very hard to do. You can just have it that we are, as it were, privileged natural objects, that we are produced by nature for the purpose of allowing nature to become self-conscious, at least in a discursive way. Okay, so what I wanted to do, I mean, I'm clearly not saying that, clearly not trying to suggest that there is a logically watertight route from Kant's treatment of teleology to absolute idealism. I just wanted to indicate the way in which, from a certain philosophical perspective, the work with its project of unifying freedom and nature, the work has, as Schelling put it, a depth of meaning and insight which seems almost unfathomable. And this is something that I think, in a sense, we can't agree with Schelling about that, or we can't see that now, because this project of unifying freedom and nature just doesn't make the same kind of sense for us as it made for Kant and his successors. Okay, thank you.